Okay. So you sent me, in anticipation of this conversation, you sent me a couple of categories that this research that you're starting to look at and admittedly gloss over quickly, kind of falls into. The first is the pre and post training effects. And the second is HRV guided training. And so obviously those are related to like this data and its link to performance. What are we starting to actually look at based on what the research is saying?
Yeah. I mean, let's just say that all of the papers have been done with the same type of measurement and all the measurements are going consistently well. So, okay, fine. Let's just say that that's happening. What can we say now about papers that look at HRV and performance? So this pre and post training effects, I'm simplifying this a little bit because there's been a bunch of studies here, but just think about it this way. Like athletes are about to do a block of training, maybe leading up to a competition. So they get their HRV and their performance measured, obviously at the beginning of the season or the training block. And then again, they're going to get their performance measured when they go and compete or at the end of the training block and how well they do in that competition. And basically what we find across these studies is that HRV doesn't trend with performance. Said another way, athletes who have better performances don't always show that their HRV increased at the time of the better performance. And so the most recent I can find on this is Singh by 2018. They kind of do a review, the links in the show notes. But yeah, HRV doesn't consistently match with better performance. And again, there is some noise. Like I said, these studies use different ways to measure HRV. Maybe that's part of the reason why there's a problem. But there's just not a clear indication that it's going in a certain way with performance. And there's also a review by Bellinger in 2016 in the show notes. They actually did look at just the effect of that one metric I mentioned, the RMSSD, the root mean successive, whatever differences between heartbeats. And they found that when that value increased, so an increase in HRV, that was associated with both better and worse performance.
Very helpful.
Okay, not so good. So the culmination of those reviews is basically saying that increasing your HRV doesn't mean that performance got better.
Got it. Okay, so the second type of research you mentioned was HRV guided training. I can guess at that, but what is that? What is that about?
Exactly. It's like what it sounds, meaning, okay, we're not just going to kind of go through our season as though we planned and see what happens to HRV. We're actually going to look at our HRV, let's say every morning, and based on our HRV, let that guide the training, right? So take HRV in the morning, and depending on the reading, maybe you would get a tailored workout to do. It might be higher or lower intensity, depending on, quote, what you can handle. And then at the end, they're going to measure the performance between the group that changed their workouts based on HRV-HD and the performance of the people who just followed a standard protocol. Maybe that was like 5 days on of high intensity, 2 rest days, something like that. Now, I can find a total of 4 studies that have looked at this kind of HRV guided training, and I'll put those links in the show notes. I actually have 4 criticisms of these studies. One, though, I think falls with our next episode a little bit better. So for now, I just want to point out some criticisms related to sample size, whether the changes in performance are really meaningful or not, and if these studies have any relevance to non-endurance-based training. So that first one is sample size. Across these 4 studies, there's a total of 125 subjects. And I'll say this a lot. I've said it before. Research like this is really hard to do. This isn't a knock on the researchers. They don't have a lot of money for these things. It's hard to actually get people to freaking complete the training. That's the reality. But I do think just knowing that, okay, like if we've got 4 studies with 125 people total, I don't know that this is enough to make a lot of broad recommendations. And this certainly is not going to be an episode about the vaccines, but if we just use a comparison that both Moderna and Pfizer were tested on 30,000 people, right? And we still have discussions about their safety and efficacy. So now if we're looking at something with HRV, which is, yes, admittedly less high stakes, but we've got less than 1% of that sample size, right? So I just kind of want to point that out. But what makes these studies even more fragile is that when we look at them independently, because that's 125 across all 4, they're like groups of 15 people and groups of 30 people or groups of 26 people. When you have small studies like that, the difference between the groups are magnified if there is one, meaning if we were to have a larger sample size, that difference often goes away. We find this all the time in nutrition studies. But as an example, the biggest effect from HRV guided training that was positive happened in the study with the smallest number of participants. 15. And the group that had the largest number of participants, 32 participants, they actually found no clear difference of using HRV guided training. So even within these 4 studies, starting to see that maybe the effect is, there because of sample size. So that's sort of my first caution, is that sample size is not that big, and it might even be affecting each independent study on that level. The second criticism is whether the change in performance is meaningful or not. And we certainly talked about this, I believe, in the biohacking podcast, that kind of clinical, right, versus statistical significance. And so, again, these studies have kind of 2 groups. One group follows this predetermined plan. One group changes their plan based on their HRV and see what happens. The first study had 26 moderately fit males. At the end of that study, the group that followed HRV guided training ran 0.4 kilometers per hour faster in a kind of a trial speed run. So said another way, in 1 hour of running, the HRV group would run 1 additional 400 meter in an hour.
Yep.
Okay. I mean, I just don't think it's that significant, but we'll come back to that. The second study had 53 moderately active individuals. Now you might say, whoa, hold on, 53, that sounds like a larger sample size. They actually broke that down into men or women. So when we looked at the women, which was 32, there was no significant difference in the HRV group. So that's interesting, was that was the largest group and there was no significant difference. And then for the men, which only had 21 of them in that group, their power output went up by 5% when they followed HRV guided training. So 5% is interesting to me. 5%, when we start looking at 5% performance differences or above, that's when I'm like, okay, that's interesting, because that's probably not placebo, right? So again, we're going to come back to that one. I just want to point out these other 2 studies. The third study was with 31 recreational endurance runners. The HRV trained group, they did see a performance improvement in a 3,000 kilometer run, but it was only by 2%, so not too much. And then that fourth study is where we found the biggest effect. It was with 15 well-trained cyclists. They found a 7% decrease in time when they went on a 40-kilometer time trial with HRV guided training. So the point here is there are 2 studies out of the 4 where we have what I would consider bigger effects, 5%, 7%. That makes me interested for sure, but we have to remember those are from the groups that were the smallest size, which brings me back to my first point. And then the other 2, where we had groups of 26 and 31, the performance effects are kind of like 2%. And so it's like, is this really meaningful? I mean, performance isn't always a linear increase. We don't, every time we go to train, just have these massive increases. Sometimes we're kind of around a noisy baseline. And so I wonder, are we just measuring the difference of natural variation in performance here? Like, is this really meaningful for a bunch of recreational athletes where we can expect there to be kind of a big flux in performance anyway? And then finally here, criticisms of these studies is we have to remember that they were only looking at running and biking. What about weightlifting? What about even, functional fitness stuff, weightlifting combined with running and biking, right? Heart rate variability makes more sense, theoretically when we're looking at running or bike or cycling, but not necessarily stuff like gymnastics, higher skill stuff or higher power. And so there's a review article in the show notes by Grandau, who they were looking at how to predict overtraining in resistance exercise. And they actually didn't look at HRV because studies haven't looked at HRV, which suggests that it probably won't be predictive. But they did look at biomarkers like hormone levels and stuff like that. And guess what they found? Quote, no marker other than sustained decrease in performance has been established as a reliable indicator of overtraining in resistance exercise, end quote. So even if you were to say, okay, you see, well, I believe that the 2% increases in performance are significant enough and they really meaningful, and whatever, the sample sizes were large enough, we still have to be careful to apply these results to people outside of running and cycling, because that's where this was all tested.
Okay, so we are going to break this up into another episode. Why don't we tease that episode and then maybe wrap up this conversation here? Where are we landing here, and where are we going to pick it back up next week?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wanted to touch on HRV because I know it's very popular right now. But I also want to remind us how we got so drilled down into looking at these studies of using HRV guided training. I mean, we're trying to predict where the athlete is on this spectrum of functional overreaching to non-functional overreaching or overtraining, which we don't have clear ways to diagnose them in the moment that they're happening. It only happens retrospectively. Regardless, okay, fine. Some are hypothesizing that the autonomic nervous system function is the lead indicator of overtraining syndrome, which again is one of the many hypotheses of symptoms that are driving overtraining. We're also saying that HRV is the best way to measure ANS function. Not totally clear to me that that's a consensus there. And then finally, we're saying that not only is HRV the best way to measure ANS, but whatever the app or tracker that you have, you're assuming that it's doing it in the most accurate way. And maybe it is. But the problem is the research has been done on so many different ways of measuring this thing, lying down, standing up, 15 minutes, awake, not awake, that the data is probably very, very limited of anything that's directly related to kind of how your app or tracker is doing it. So, okay, fine enough. Let's say all of those steps are true and that all of those things are totally legit. Now we're down to the point where we've got 4 studies of 125 people with the criticisms I just raised, you know? And so to kind of tease the next episode, which is also sort of gets to that 4th criticism that I left off and we're going to get to, I'm just not convinced that this is the best indicator that we have in real time of what performance is doing. I think we've gotten so in the weeds of coming up with the best way to measure recovery or the best way to measure autonomic nervous system function when we're losing sight of the fact that we care about performance. That's the end goal. And that was even happening when I was looking at the papers. I was like, okay, well, this isn't the right way to measure HRV. No, this is the better way. No, this is the best. You get so in the weeds of figuring out the best way to measure HRV. And you're like, wait, what are we doing this for? And so I think we have a better, albeit not perfect way to assess and predict performance for sure.